Hello and welcome to Scream Scene, the horror movie podcast where we watch every horror movie ever made in chronological order, and then we rank them from best to worst. My name's Sarah.
And I'm Ben.
Oh, that was a deep voice, whoa.
Oh, that's just how my voice sounds. That's just my normal voice.
It's like, hey, I'm Sarah, and I'm Ben.
You should probably know what my voice sounds like.
I know, okay, anyways, thank you for listening to Scream Scene. How are you doing, Ben?
I'm doing alright.
Maybe it's just because last week you had, like, an easy listening voice, and now you're, like, bassy voice.
Count Basie. How are you, Sarah?
Doing pretty good, considering the last few weeks, which, listener, if you haven't listened to our last episode, I had pneumonia for, like, a week or so, and that was terrible.
Mm-hmm. But you seem much better now.
I am, yes. I'm also pretty excited for this week's movie.
Yeah, this is another Val Lewton RKO movie, the follow-up to Cat People, which you and I quite like.
Yes.
It's I Walked with a Zombie from 1943.
Cat People was late 42. I don't know what month we're in 43, but would the timing have been that, like, they were in production for I Walked with a Zombie before Cat People had even been released?
That's correct.
Oh.
Cat People had shot in the summer of 1942 and was released in December of 1942. And as we mentioned in that episode, it was quite a big success. It had cost the studio just under $150,000 and had made $8 million at the box office. The second assignment for Val Lewton's B-horror unit at RKO was shot in October-November 1942, so it was in the can before Cat People was even released, and then was itself released in April of 43.
Okay.
It's worth stating that I Walked with a Zombie is, yes, a zombie movie, but in 1943, zombie meant like a Haitian voodoo concept, not your George A. Romero undead, brain-eating, shambling sort of monsters.
Well, there's shambling.
Well,
there's
yes.
Shambling in Haitian voodoo.
But they're not, like, decomposing, usually.
No.
That you get sort of from the late 60s onwards. That really, in terms of, like, traditional folklore, have more to do with ghouls. Which, that's a whole other thing we can talk about when we get to Night of the Living Dead in like a million episodes. But if you haven't listened to previous episodes on movies like White Zombie or Revolt of the Zombies, it might be a good time to do a brief primer on Haiti and Haitian voodoo and voodoo zombies.
I can certainly offer that.
It's good.
People. For in-depth coverage of Haiti's history and Haitian voodoo, definitely check out episode 32 on White Zombie. That's kind of the biggest one that you'll get most information from. But here's kind of a primer. Voodoo as a practice, as a religion, originates in West Africa, in and around Ghana. With the slave trade, these traditions spread and throughout the many years morphed into different and distinct traditions. So New Orleans voodoo is different from Haitian voodoo. For the slaves brought to Haiti, there were laws dictating compulsory conversion to Catholicism, mainly with the 1685 Code Noir. The intent behind doing this is to have these slaves be removed from their culture and from their social ties, so there's a less likelihood that they will revolt, basically, that they'll join together. Now, both Catholicism and voodoo have a pantheon of saints and gods, respectively. So to practice in secret, voodoo beliefs were kind of mapped onto Catholic ones. With Haiti, because of its history as kind of a Spanish and or French colony, depending on the time of history, voodoo itself kind of morphs into a very unique and Creole religion.
Mm-hmm.
Further unique about Haitian voodoo is its ties to emancipation. 1685's Code Noir legislated corporal punishment and other very brutal treatments of slaves. Those that revolted and escaped formed disparate raiding groups, but they were very, segmented. Voodoo helped actually organize and bring these groups together, and this is kind of seen clearly in the example of one voodoo priest known as Macandal. He escaped in 1751, and over 6 years he helped unite these raiding bands. In 1791, the Haitian Revolution began with a voodoo ceremony, with former slaves pledging themselves in the fight for freedom, which they won in 1804. Despite these ties between Haiti's history and Haitian voodoo, it's not recognized as an official religion, because voodoo and its practitioners are both respected and feared. Voodoo, as it's practiced in Haiti, involves invoking different spirits through sacrifice. Similar to the Catholic patron saints, these spirits, or Loa, have different icons. One that will be name-dropped in I Walked with a Zombie is Danbala, who is the father of the sky. You have two different types of priests, Hungans, who are male priests, and Mambos, who are female priests. And these leaders do good spells to help the community. Bokor are quote-unquote evil priests who cast darker spells, and the Bokor are who create zombies. Now, for Haitian voodoo, what a zombie is basically someone who has died, but their soul has been trapped in a jar, and the Bokor will, using the soul trapped in a jar, give commands to this walking cadaver. This zombie is gaunt, has gray skin, staring eyes, and walks as if in a trance. Now, in 1982, ethnobotanist Wade Davis went to Haiti and did some investigation about zombies, and did verify that the use of herbs and pufferfish neurotoxin can, quote-unquote, kill a victim. Basically puts them in a coma so that they, quote-unquote, die. Later, that person will awake, and then using different herbs, they can be put into a trance and made susceptible to commands and suggestion. So there is an underlying truth to the fear about zombies.
Yeah, and his sort of findings in the 80s, I think, were backed up by the fact that the legal language around zombies in, Haitian law refers to it a lot of the times as, a process of putting people, under your control through drugs and stuff. That, that as much as it was, news for, the white academic community of, oh, yeah, what they're actually doing is using, drugs to put people under. I feel like there's almost a sense that, yeah, the people in Haiti already knew that.
Definitely. The Haitian Criminal Code in 1883, and even when it was updated in 2011, outlaws the making of zombies in not so many words. Quote, poisoning without death and causing a more or less prolonged state of lethargy. And the punishment for this is equal to the punishment for murder. Interest in zombies and in Haiti in general in the American public increased after the publication of 1929's The Magic Island from writer and reporter William B. Seabrook. And we saw that interest directly influence the production of White Zombie in 1932 and kind of continue. But I will note, you kind of gave this bit in the beginning, but there's only been 3 prior zombie movies before I Walked with a Zombie, and that's White Zombie in 1932, Revolt of the Zombies in 1936, which we watched and put on the miscellaneous list because not only is it just bad, but it's an adventure movie, and then King of the Zombies in 1941, which is a comedy.
Yes. It is a Poverty Row comedy film that features a lot of, minstrel-style humor.
Oh, no.
As well as, a very, I think World War II, Nazi involved plot, because it all comes to pass that it's actually, the Nazis trying to make zombies in the Caribbean to serve as, like, an army?
Well, maybe that can go on our, like,
Horror adjacent.
horror adjacent list.
Yes.
For Patreon stuff. So that's kind of voodoo and kind of how people are thinking about voodoo in the States. Haiti has a very tumultuous history, and when I gave its history in the White Zombie episode, I kind of stopped around this point, but now I'm going to give you a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Like I mentioned, Haiti's independence was gained in 1804. Between 1804 and 1943, Haiti's struggling to continue uniting its regions. For example, its first leader declared himself Emperor Jacques I, ruled for 2 years, and then was assassinated.
Right.
And that kind of is the story for a lot of their leaders. A lot of Haiti's leaders were dictators, and it was just a rough time throughout the 1800s for them. So we have a bit of a revolving door of leaders until 1867, when a constitutional government structure was established. Presidents were still kind of overthrown back to back. Now, it's funny that you bring up the Nazi Germany plot in King of the Zombies, because in the early 1900s, there was a German community in Haiti that at this time had significant economic power, and they were leveraging this into political power. The US, wanting to limit this influence, started putting investments into Haiti and ultimately bought Haiti's national bank around 1910 to 11. Because they own the national bank, corporations and countries started complaining to the US that Haiti was defaulting on loans, so the US decided to occupy Haiti from 1915 to 1934. Mm-hmm. The U.S. instituted mandatory labor laws to build infrastructure across the country. And while, building infrastructure is a good idea and it was improved, it came at the cost of forced labor and protests and revolts, which were violently put down. And historians estimate around 15,000 people were killed as a result of the violence during this time.
Yeah, and that was sort of where we were at when we watched White Zombie, because that was 1932.
Yeah, so this occupation ended in 34, though the U.S. would continue control of Haiti's external finances until 1947. And part of the reason why the U.S. started to leave is because Stenio Vincent was elected in around 1930, and he was very adamant about, get the U.S. out of here. Vincent was democratically elected, but he used the national stability and professionalized military to establish absolute power for himself.
Sure, like you do.
Yeah, so he was president until 1941. He had planned to continue his presidency for a third consecutive term, but the U.S. kind of looked at him, flexed their military muscles and economic power muscles, and so he gave power to his successor, Eli Lescaut, who would eventually be overthrown in 1946 due to a violent revolution. But during this particular time, 1943, for I Walked with a Zombie, Eli Lescaut is president.
So the impression I get from that is that, even if the U.S. occupation is over, there's still,
managing Haiti's finances.
Well, and also, pretty helicopter over their, political situation as well. Do
you mean helicopter parenting?
Yeah. In the sense of, okay, well, but this is who your president is going to be, and, this is how the election is going to go, and that kind of stuff.
I mean, it's not like that's never happened in the history of the United States foreign policy
for
with
sure.
People south of their borders.
Sure. I just was, trying to establish that, them pulling out from the occupation really wasn't, an end to them trying to basically, run Haiti for Haiti. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So that's Haiti right now,
mm-hmm.
and that also gives you a snapshot into voodoo and Haitian voodoo, which is kind of where we started with this little bit of research.
Mm-hmm. So the reason why I Walked with a Zombie is about zombies and voodoo and all of that it comes back to the rules for making horror movies that Val Lewton operated under at RKO. There were 3 rules that he had to follow that were dictated to him by the studio for each movie he made. Each film had to be brought in under $150,000, and each film had to be brought in, I believe, under 75 minutes long. And also, Lewton could not pick the titles for his movies. Each title was dictated to him ahead of time by the studio marketing department, and then he had to develop a movie around that title. So in this case, the studio's marketing department had bought the film rights for a magazine article, I Walked with a Zombie, by Inez Wallace.
Inez Wallace lived from 1888 to 1966. She lived in Cleveland, Ohio, and she was an entertainment columnist for Cleveland's magazine Plain Dealer. She would often write feature magazine articles and short story fiction in Collier's magazine, This Week, and American Weekly Standard. Reportedly, she wrote scripts for radio and TV programs, but it's 1943, so I don't think at least the television stuff has kind of happened. Mm-hmm. But I can also find no further details about what episodes that would be, what show that might have been for.
So this article by Wallace, I Walked with a Zombie, RKO had licensed the film rights, but really all Lewton had to use from it was the title. That was sort of what was required. Now, Lewton hated this title, which had a format that's very common to confessional articles that were very popular at the time. You read a lot of magazines from the 40s or the 50s, you'll see a lot of articles that have titles, like, I worked at a newsstand, or I dated a juvenile delinquent, or
I married an axe murderer.
Sure. This kind of title. Now, Wallace's article was not about, anything supernatural. It was about her experience meeting zombies, that is, people she encountered while at a plantation in Haiti, whose vocal cords and cognitive abilities had been impaired by drugs, rendering them obedient servants who would understand and follow simple orders from the plantation owners. Lewton had to take this title and make something of it, and decided to make the best of the situation by crafting what he called Jane Eyre in the West Indies. Now, Jane Eyre is a pretty significant novel in, literary history, and it kind of has a big influence on the horror genre, despite not really being horror itself. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk a bit more about that, since you're the Gothic novel expert?
For sure. So Jane Eyre was published in 1847 in 3 volumes that were published separately throughout the year. It has 32 chapters. I will be giving a very brief synopsis about the book. So it's by Charlotte Bronte, and it's notable in its first-person narrative and of Jane's own reflections. And it's kind of the first time that you have a piece of literature showing how the main character's psychology can color interpretations of the actions or events that go on in the book. So across these 32 chapters, it follows most of Jane's life, but kind of most relevant to us is when she arrives at Thornfield Hall. She's to be the governess to a little girl named Adele. Master of the house is Edward Rochester, who is just the most Byronic person.
Yes.
Weird things go on in the house. It's a big spooky mansion, Gothic literature, Gothic novel, Gothic house. You know the tropes. In the midst of all of that, Jane and Edward fall in love. The wedding is about to happen, but then at the 11th hour, Edward turns out he can't marry as he's already married.
Shock.
His wife, Bertha, is insane and locked up in Thornfield Hall.
In the attic.
In the attic. The mad woman in the attic. And who's been causing all of these mysterious incidents, like lighting people on fire and shit like that. So Jane is like, what the fuck, and leaves him. She has some more independent adventures because it's a long, long book. And then she is about to, like, really start falling in love with this other guy and getting over Rochester when she hears Rochester's voice in the wind calling to her. So she goes back to Thornfield Hall, and it's a completely, like, demolished house. It's been burned up in a fire. Turns up, Bertha started a fire and killed herself by jumping out of a very high window. Edward tried to save her and stop her, and in the process went blind and lost a hand. But,
like you do.
But Jane still loves him, and they marry, and it ends with Edward getting just enough sight recovered to see their newborn son. So that is Jane Eyre. Now, there's a lot in there, and I think what probably happened is they just mapped some of these, like, major plot points of, like, lady coming here to take care of someone, starts to fall in love with, like, broody, Byronic master of the house, and mysterious things happening.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they took from Jane Eyre.
Well, I mean, a lot of what is in Jane Eyre really became, like, pretty familiar tropes of, like, the developing Gothic literature genre, right? Like, I mean, obviously the idea of the big spooky house was already in existence beforehand, but yeah, like, the number of stories I've seen that are, like, pretty much Jane Eyre, or you can point at and say, like, well, this comes from Jane Eyre, is, pretty significant. I mean, even up to movies like Crimson Peak recently.
Oh, definitely. One of the big things with Jane Eyre is that it's not a ghost.
Right.
It's just a lady.
Right.
Who, like, sure, she's insane, but it's not a supernatural being who's making these mysterious things happen.
Right. But yeah, like, the Gothic novel, as we've sort of talked about in earlier episodes of Scream Scene, evolved into the 20th century by splitting into, like, the mystery novel, the romance novel, and the horror novel as, like, 3 separate genres.
Yeah.
So, to write this disguised adaptation of Jane Eyre, Lewton and RKO brought on Kurt Siodmak, the architect of much of competitor Universal's recent success that they have been trying to emulate. Most significantly, the writer of The Wolfman, but, most recently, the writer of Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman.
Yeah.
Lewton wanted the film's treatment of Haitian voodoo to be authentic and encouraged Siodmak to research the practices, which Lewton did as well, to a somewhat obsessive degree. He was quite invested in trying to make sure that, like, they were accurate to what was, I guess, known of Haitian voodoo. So, Siodmak's story was about the wife of a plantation owner who is turned into a zombie so she won't leave her husband. This was not quite what Lewton was looking for, so after the first draft by Siodmak, he turned it over to writer Ardell Ray for rewrites. Born in 1907 in Spokane, Washington, to 2 West Coast stage actors, Ardell Ray's parents separated when she was a young girl, and this led to her bouncing between living with her mother, grandparents, or a boarding house. Her mother remarried in 1915, and Ardell came to live with her and her new stepfather in Los Angeles. After graduating high school, she worked as a fashion model, but made the decision not to go into acting. In 1931, she began working as a studio story editor, first at Universal, then in 1933 at Warner Brothers, to Fox in 1936, and finally to RKO in 1938. In 1939, she divorced her second husband, and in 1941, she joined RKO's Young Writers Project, a program at the studio intended to cultivate writing talent among the studio's existing employee base. I Walked with a Zombie was her big break, as rejecting Siodmak's draft put Lewton behind schedule, and his low budget meant he had to find someone already on studio payroll to do the rewrites, rather than another outside hire. Ray delivered her script within a tight time frame, hitting the gothic atmosphere and brooding sort of visuals and characters that Lewton wanted to capture, and thus earning herself a place on his regular team. As with all of his films of this period, Lewton wrote the final draft of the script himself, but left his contributions uncredited in deference to his writers. After such a successful collaboration on Cat People, Lewton once again brought in Jacques Tourneur to direct, music by Roy Webb, and editing by Mark Robeson. However, cinematography this time is by J. Roy Hunt, an experienced DOP with a career dating back to 1916.
Whoa.
His best-known film outside of this one might be the live-action photography for 1949's Mighty Joe Young.
Oh, yeah, the King Kong ripoff. Yep.
The King Kong ripoff by the people who made King Kong.
Yeah.
The star of the film is actress Frances D. Born in LA in 1909, she began working as a movie extra on a lark during summer vacation following her sophomore year of university. In 1930, while still working as an extra, she was cast as the female lead in Paramount's musical comedy Playboy of Paris. She starred in the controversial 1931 Joseph von Sternberg film An American Tragedy, and several other popular Paramount pictures in the early 30s. She met actor Joel McCrea in 1933, and the two soon married. Dee switched to McCrea's studio, RKO, where she appeared in films such as Of Human Bondage and Becky Sharp. She was still under contract with RKO when I Walked with a Zombie was made, though she was no longer as big a star as she once was. She would retire from acting in 1953, and her husband would pass away in 1990 on their 57th wedding anniversary. She passed away following a stroke at the age of 94 in 2004.
94.
Mm-hmm. Opposite Frances D. is Tom Conway, reappearing from Cat People. He was the psychologist in that movie.
Mm-hmm.
In the time between the two films, he had made his second appearance as the Falcon in 1943's The Falcon Strikes Back. The film's second male lead is played by James Ellison. The 33-year-old actor had gotten his start about 10 years earlier at Paramount, earning early recognition as Johnny Nelson, the sidekick of Hopalong Cassidy in the popular long-running Western series. He spent most of his career switching between Westerns and other B-movie fare. We last saw James Ellison as the Scotland Yard detective in The Undying Monster.
He was alright in that, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was basically Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, with a spunky girl sidekick. Edith Barrett, formerly of Orson Welles' Mercury Theatre Company, appears in the role of Conway's mother, although she was in fact 3 years younger than him at the time of making this film. She married fellow Mercury Theatre actor Vincent Price in 1938.
Yes!
With whom she had one son, though they divorced in 1948. Ironically, she would appear as Mrs. Fairfax in 20th Century Fox's straight adaptation of Jane Eyre later in 1943. Lewton's desire for authenticity extended to wanting to cast real calypso singers and dancers and other black performers to portray the voodoo practitioners and island natives. Teresa Harris, born in 1906 in Houston, Texas, was an African-American actress, singer, and dancer who was cast in the film. She studied at UCLA Conservatory of Music and made her film debut in 1929's Thunderbolt as a nightclub singer. Throughout the 1930s, she primarily appeared as maids, waitresses, etc., and was often uncredited. By 1937, she was getting frustrated over the lack of parts for African-American actresses in Hollywood films, and began appearing in race films, believing competition from outside producers would force Hollywood to provide better parts for black performers. Which isn't really how it shook out. Lewton had actually cast Harris already as a waitress in Cat People, and he had really liked her performance there, so he made a point to use her again in I Walked with a Zombie. Lewton also brought on popular calypso singer Sir Lancelot.
All right.
Born Lancelot Pernard in Trinidad in 1902, he initially studied to be a pharmacist, but switched to music after hearing African-American concert tenor Roland Haynes perform. He made his debut as Sir Lancelot in 1940 at the Village Vanguard in New York, and quickly became the top calypso performer in the United States, and is considered responsible for popularizing the genre in America. His family in Trinidad disowned him, however. His father was a government official there, and believed that his son's calypso singing brought shame to their family name. Sir Lancelot wrote the song Shame and Scandal in response, which he performs in I Walked with a Zombie, the first American motion picture to feature calypso music. Sir Lancelot was popular nationwide throughout the 1940s and remained active as a musician until the mid-1970s. He passed away in 2001 at the age of 98.
Damn, 98. That's... All these people are very long-lived.
Everybody who made this movie did great in terms of their lifespan, except for
Val Lewton.
So as I mentioned earlier, the film was shot between October 26th and November 19th in 1942.
So they filmed on Halloween?
Correct. Significantly, however, this was before Cat People was even released, so the huge success of that movie was not a factor in how RKO budgeted or planned I Walked with a Zombie.
Would it have impacted the post-production process in the sense of, like, RKO having more confidence in Lewton and giving him a bit more independence?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good assumption. They lost 5 days from their location shooting schedule due to wartime gasoline rationing.
Sure.
So, this film was made on a tight budget and a tight schedule. And that's sort of what's significant, I think, to looking at this movie. So as I mentioned earlier, I Walked with a Zombie premiered on April 21st, 1943 in New York, the same day that Jacques Tourneur's father, Maurice Tourneur's film La Main du Diable opened in France. The film's wide release began on April 30th. It was another big box office hit for RKO and was held in theaters throughout 1943.
Oh, wow. That's impressive, because, like, it's coming out in, like, the early 3rd.
Yeah, it came out in April, and I think it ran in theaters until December sometime.
Yeah, that's the majority of the year.
Critical reviews for the film were mixed. The New York Times called it dull and disgusting. The Boston Globe called it melodramatic and unconvincing.
I mean, melodramatic, sure.
But the New York Daily News praised the film, calling it spine-chilling. As with most of Lewton's RKO output, modern critics consider the film to be a classic, and it is heavily praised for its style and atmosphere. Lewton himself thought of it as the best film that he produced during this period, despite never growing to really like that title.
So how are we watching it?
Well, Sarah, I Walked with a Zombie is available on DVD as part of the Val Lewton Horror Collection from Warner Home Video.
Cool, well luckily we own that.
Yes. It was a Christmas present to you.
Yes, it was. From you. Funny how that worked out.
Yep.
Well, folks, if you would like to watch along, get someone in your life who will buy it for you for Christmas. You are going to hear a brief musical break, and when we come back, we will discuss I Walked with a Zombie from 1943, directed by Jacques Tourneur.
See you on the other side, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to Scream Scene. Sarah and I just finished watching I Walked with a Zombie from 1943, directed by Jacques Tourneur. Sarah, you and I have both seen this movie before. I think it's fair to say we both like it.
Yes.
The last time you watched this movie with me, I remember our feelings being that I liked this better than Cat People, and you preferred Cat People to this. Would you say that's still the way you feel?
Yeah, I think this movie is really good, but it's a little bit of, I don't want to say bait and switch, but like it draws you in, and it's just slower paced than I think I would prefer, and it's a very quiet film, and it's definitely good, but comparing it to Cat People, I think I prefer Cat People.
It's really interesting because there's a lot going on in this movie, but on paper, not a lot really happens. And it's definitely a movie that, like, runs a lot on mood and atmosphere. I don't think it's unfair to bring up the issue of bait and switch because, thanks to RKO's marketing department, a lot of Lewton movies were kind of, by their very nature, like bait and switch movies, because you were always being drawn in by the promise of some lurid, cheesy B movie, and then getting, like, these Val Lewton movies instead that are always much more thoughtful than what you thought you were getting.
Yeah, and I think this film is a great example of that. I think there's, like, a few different layers of the bait and switch. So we have the bait and switch that you just described. Then we have one where, like, the film's opening from the score to the font choice, like, it's just very, like, this is a romantic film.
Right, which is, you know... and
not wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that's an element in the Gothic genre.
Yeah, and then it just, like, goes into horror. And the horror that it even is a very quiet, not timid, but just a quiet kind of horror.
So, let's walk through the plot. And I think maybe a key distinction needs to be made here because a lot of the story of I Walked with a Zombie happens before the plot begins. The plot, as I was kind of alluding to earlier, not a lot actually happens, but a big part of the plot is basically figuring out the backstory of what's happening, and that story is very, like, involved and complicated. So that's maybe just a distinction to draw here.
So the film begins with Betsy Connell, who is a Canadian nurse, recounting the time she walked with a zombie.
Yeah, it's all in flashback voiceover, and it's her
voice works for like a Jane Eyre thing.
Yeah, and her voiceover dialogue, text, narration is written in a style that feels like those confessional magazine articles that we were talking about earlier too.
And even the tone of her voice is like, it sounds so strange to say it out loud.
Yeah.
So it that's what I kind of mean by, like, the bait and switch.
Happened to a friend of mine.
So Betsy has been hired as the nurse for Jessica, who is the wife of sugar plantation owner Paul Holland on the island of Saint Sebastian, basically Haiti.
Yeah, Saint Sebastian, the island in this movie, is not a real place, but I get the impression that in terms of, like, the various Caribbean islands, it's meant to fictionally be one of the, like, British Commonwealth ones, just judging from Paul being British and summoning a nurse from Canada and things like that.
On the island, there is a small white community, and the majority of the population are the descendants of African slaves. It's made obvious that Holland's family is descended of slave owners and profiteers of the slave trade, because they have in the courtyard the figurehead of one such slave ship, which has quite a gruesome expression on its face. So kind of the cast of characters, just to lay it all out on the table, we have Betsy, Jessica, the wife who is the zombie. She, is in a trance, basically. Paul, who is the master of the house, the Rochester, as it were. Wesley, who is Paul's half-brother. Mrs. Rand, who is their mother. And Alma gets an honorable mention here as as played by Teresa Harris.
She's the basically the housekeeper.
Now, we're told directly that Jessica had a serious illness and her spinal cord was damaged as a result. But we learn the real story near the climax of the film. Of course, we get hints sprinkled throughout, but here's the real story. So Paul and Wesley are half-brothers, as I mentioned. Paul has a British accent, Wesley has an American accent, and it's just kind of explained that Mrs. Rand, their mom, had Paul, that's her first son, and then it's not really mentioned what happened to the dad.
Presumably he must have died.
Yeah.
Because I don't see her being able to, like, divorce him, but still living on the island that, like, his fort is on.
Wesley is the son from her second marriage to a missionary. So Paul went to school in Britain, Wesley went to school in America. They have different accents. That's how that's explained. Lampshaded a little bit. Jessica, who's described as, like, the most beautiful woman ever to have walked, she was actually going to leave Paul for Wesley. Now, Mrs. Rand's second husband, Wesley's dad, has since died, but she's kind of continued the missionary work on the island, and not so much like being a doctor, because she doesn't have a medical degree, but trying to encourage science among the locals.
Yeah, and improve their, like, overall health and well-being.
Yeah. Turns out, in order to help promote, or at the very least, persuade the locals into following her advice, she started invoking voodoo. She gives the example of, I told them to boil water to prevent illness. They continued to do it, so I said that the spirits would chase away evil spirits in the water. Then they started doing it. Good intention, not the best thing to be doing.
Yeah, she's claiming that their gods speak through her, which is,
something.
Yeah, exactly.
At the news of Jessica leaving Paul for Wesley, Mrs. Rand became furious about Jessica breaking up her family. She's worked hard to bring these two half-brothers together, and now this is all going to shit. So during a voodoo ceremony, she claims she was possessed and asked the Hungan, the male priest, to turn Jessica, an evil woman, into a zombie. And that's how Jessica became the way she is. So as the film goes, eerie things occur, and Betsy finds herself falling in love with Paul, and therefore becomes more determined to find a cure for Jessica. From Alma, she learns about voodoo and takes Jessica to basically the voodoo church, where the villagers realize that Jessica is, in fact, a zombie. They begin to investigate her, but that investigation is cut short, so the villagers set their own zombie, Carrefour, to go get her. They also tried to cast a spell on Jessica so she will come to them. With the revelation that Jessica is a zombie, Wesley feels that she must die rather than continue living this, like, half-life. Now, this climax is kind of intercut between Wesley following Jessica going to the voodoo church and the scene in the voodoo church where they are casting the spell for Jessica to come to them, and using basically a voodoo doll to represent her. But Wesley follows her out of the manor house and murders her. And we see the murder just as we see the needle being put into Jessica's voodoo doll. Carrefour had also been following Wesley and Jessica and is still intent on taking Jessica's body. Wesley is carrying Jessica, flees away from Carrefour, and goes into the sea, where he then drowns. And the end of the film comes as Wesley and Jessica's bodies are brought back to the manor. Mrs. Rand, Betsy, and Paul are grieving, and there's a voiceover of a Bible passage. Do you have anything to say about the Bible passage?
I'm not 100% sure if it's, like, a Bible passage, just because it's so... Or maybe it's, like, an interpolated one, but it's, like... It has that kind of biblical language about, like, oh, yay, oh Lord, kind of stuff. But it's also super specific to this situation, so I'm not sure if it's just meant to be, like, the voice of their priest or what have you. I mean, it sounds very Christian, but also, like, as you explained at the top of the show, voodoo has those Christian elements, like, layered within it.
Well, anyways, that's the end. The lighting and atmosphere of this movie is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have any scares in the way that you would think of, like, something being scary. Like the movie Us, you know? But I would argue that this film has tension going on. And that's why, to me, it feels like a very quiet kind of horror. There's no real jump scares in the same way that Cat People has the bus.
There is one Lewton bus in the movie. It's not really a significant moment in the movie, and I don't think it's something that, like, is as memorable as anything that happens in Cat People, but there is one, which is a scene at night where
Carrefour has made it into the manor house, and we see his shadow going around, and we hear his shuffling. Betsy goes out to investigate because she hears things, and she jumps at, like, a squawk or thing from a frog, who then hops into a pond.
Yeah, there's also... I wasn't really mentioning the frog, because that felt more like atmosphere, but specifically the, like, owl that flies by her and just gives, like, a kind of bird squawk. But yeah, it's like a very mild thing. Mm-hmm. I think, you know, you say the movie doesn't really have scares, and that's true in, I guess, the sense that, yeah, like, there isn't anything really, like, jumping out at you. But I also feel like that might depend on what you find scary. Because, like, for my money, this kind of, like, quiet scare, quiet terror is much closer to the kind of situations where I'm afraid. Because I don't spend a lot of my life getting chased by, like, serial killers through mazes or whatever. So, like...
Do you get followed by zombies?
No, but, like, I have had, you know, nights where you can't sleep and you are up late and, you know, there's just the way that the shadows of trees play across things, or the sound of the wind at night, or, you know, when you're alone at night but you can't shake the feeling that you're being watched or followed, or you hear noises you can't explain. That's kind of the stuff that makes you afraid more regularly in real life, right? And I feel like this movie evokes that a lot. In terms of, like, you know, in Cat People we talked about the bus and also the pool scene. Mm-hmm. And in terms of, like, what the big scene equivalent in I Walk with a Zombie is, it's probably the scene where Betsy is taking Jessica to the home fort, the voodoo church, and they're going through the sugarcane fields, this kind of, like, circuitous route you have to take that's marked by all these various like voodoo symbols, and they basically just bump right into Carrefour, who's just standing in the middle of the field, like, basically guarding things. Like, if you're not allowed to pass, he wouldn't have let them pass. And it's just, you know, they walk right up to him and shine the flashlight in his face, and it's just this, like, sudden, like, whoa kind of moment. And what makes it effective really is just the, like, very unique appearance of Carrefour, where he's this very tall, very gaunt man with these sort of bugged out dead eyes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the other thing that helps add to the tension that we're both kind of describing is the sound design.
Oh, absolutely.
So in Cat People, the sound design is very notable, but I think I Walk with a Zombie, the people doing the sound design have really struck gold.
Yeah, I think that's the real secret weapon of this movie.
Mm-hmm. So we will hear drums in the distance. We'll hear horns in the distance. When Carrefour is in the manor house, we hear shuffling, and it sounds like he's shuffling around where you are. Even the moment that Ben described with the jump scare of the owl, like, all of that atmosphere, the sound design of the courtyard is incredibly well done. And it makes the moments where it's quiet and there's silence really evocative and really stand out.
And not in the Night Monster way of we just turned on a sound effect and then suddenly turned it off again.
Correct. Yeah, everything here is very well constructed. Speaking as someone who does audio, everything here is, like, incredibly well designed. Everything is serving a purpose. And I think the biggest moment of silence comes it happens here and there, but the biggest moment is right when Jessica is killed. So we see one of the voodoo practitioners have Jessica's doll, and we see him take a needle and put it into the doll. And as this is going, we hear the voodoo drums, the particular beat that they're doing, the chanting, and then as soon as that needle is in, it's silence. And part of that is because that's right when we cut to Wesley standing up from Jessica's body, who he is clearly just attacked, and it's silence. And it's very powerful.
And it's basically silent in the movie from then on to the end, with the exception of the voiceover dialogue that we mentioned, and like some, sounds of the waves of the water, but they're very sort of subtle and subdued. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the sound design here, it creates a very terrifying sense of place. And it not only creates that place, but it transports you as an audience member to that place. And it kind of just, for my money, it sort of builds and sustains this palpable mood of dread through the whole movie that only gets released at that moment that you mention.
It's funny that you described it as being released, because to me I feel the weight of that silence.
One of the things that strikes me watching this movie is, so in the film industry, you always want things done well, fast, and cheap. And the conventional wisdom is that you can only pick two of those things. And I Walked with a Zombie, I think, holds a lot of sway over me as a sometime filmmaker, because it manages to do all three of those things. It was shot, in 5 days less than they had scheduled, for under $150,000, which is like $2.2 million today, and it turned out to be an incredible film. So I think that's something that really gives it a lot of cachet with me, is seeing them pull that off. It looks fantastic. I know we've been talking about the sound design. You briefly touched on the look of the film. It continues on the same sort of dark, high contrast style of Cat People. And again, it's this kind of haunting, nightmarish atmosphere that it conjures up. And most of all, what I noticed about this movie, even more than in Cat People, was the use of shadows. Not just as a place where the scary thing might be hiding, like in Cat People, but shadows that sort of play across people's faces or across surfaces. When you're getting the shuffling feet of Carrefour, you're also seeing his shadow move around. But even imagery of like the shadow of a tree branch going over Betsy's face, or various things like that, just really contribute to the overall mood and atmosphere of this movie.
Yeah, the shadows somehow make the movie feel bigger, or the set feel bigger.
Right.
Which is strange, because you'd think it would make it feel more claustrophobic. Like, that's how shadows have been used in the past, is to make it feel enclosed.
I think it's because it helps make the, small, probably relatively inexpensive sets feel more like real places, because you're getting the shadow of trees that you don't actually see.
Yeah.
But since there's a shadow of a tree, there must be a space for a tree out there somewhere. But, to create the shadow, you just need to stick a branch in front of a light, right? It's a very good trick. The cast of this film is uniformly marvelous.
Yes, yeah.
Frances D. Sort of holds it all together. She's kind of the audience's anchor, I think. The most kind of normal person in the movie.
That's Betsy, by the way.
Yes. Frances D. plays Betsy. Meanwhile, Tom Conway is very disarming as Paul. You never quite know if you should believe or trust anything he says. I'm never quite sure if he's a good guy or a bad guy. I
love that his brother explicitly describes Paul as Byronic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Speaking of, I think James Ellison gets the role of a lifetime here as Wesley. That's the kind of role I loved to play when I acted. Someone who has a past that isn't really plainly spoken about so much as it's kind of something you have to read between the lines. Ellison delivers on all of that wonderfully. It's kind of incredible to see him do this, after seeing him in Undying Monster, where, like, he was fine, but, like, anyone mildly handsome and articulate could play that part.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, this is a real role. Then there's Edith Barrett, who is fantastic as Mrs. Rand, who is probably one of the most utterly compelling and fascinating female characters we've seen on the show so far. I can't recall immediately another female character with as many facets as her, at least not recently. Then there's, of course, the unforgettable image of Darby Jones in the wordless role of Carrefour the Zombie, which is such a memorable look that it was parodied exactly by Jones 2 years later in RKO's Zombies on Broadway, starring Bela Lugosi.
Oh my God.
Where it's a comedy film. It's about Bela Lugosi's character, who I think is like a mad scientist or something, coming to St. Sebastian and, like, using Carrefour as a zombie to do various things. And Sir Lancelot's in it as well, doing Calypso stuff. But it's a total parody. Equally mesmerizing, for my money, is Hanno Moxer, who is the saber man, or sabuer, of the voodoo rituals. He's not the Hungan, but, like, he gets way more screen time and, like, magnetic kind of personality than the Hungan does.
I think it's because I don't think he has any lines.
No.
But he's the one who we first see dancing, and he's dancing with a sword, and he's the one who is enacting some of the rituals to have Jessica come or to have Carrefour go get her. Mm-hmm. Because most of the stuff he's doing is dancing. The physicality of it, I think, is what's memorable with him.
Absolutely. There's also a sense that, and I think we'll get into this a lot more later, there's a lot of stuff in this movie that gets left up to audience interpretation. And with his character, there's this sense that, like, the Hungan, we don't really see a lot of, but he seems to be kind of allied with Mrs. Rand. Like, she's kind of controlling this whole voodoo practice on this island. Whereas the Saberman feels like he's independent of the Hungan. Like, when he and the other islanders start doing the rituals to control Jessica or Wesley, like, that's obviously not under Mrs. Rand's direction, but also I don't really see the Hungan anywhere either. It's like taking back their practices for their own use rather than the way they've been kind of used by Mrs. Rand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. To that point, Mrs. Rand is a little bit of a paradox for me in this film, because she, like, obviously, white woman leading the voodoo church, that's going to be a yikes for me. When we see her talking about her role with the islanders, this is before we see that she's doing voodoo stuff, she has such an attitude about them being, like, primitive or lesser. She just has such, like, a stick up her butt, nose high over these people because of these, like, superstitions they have. And then she's using those superstitions to her advantage, not only for, like, a fairly well-meaning intent of, you know, health and wellness, but then using those beliefs to then commit murder on her behalf.
The thing that's interesting about her is, I mean, she's a very complex character with a lot of facets. She's very three-dimensional. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we're used to that on Scream Scene, because even in, like, the best horror movies we've watched, characters are maybe at most two-dimensional. And the thing about her that's really interesting is that she is pretty nice to our lead character, Betsy. She never really directly threatens her. She's clearly very intelligent. She's clearly got a lot of resources, and, you know, she also clearly loves her sons a lot when she admits what she believes is her part in Jessica's condition. She clearly feels like a lot of guilt and remorse, but she also clearly wields a lot of power and is very comfortable wielding a lot of power. When Betsy discovers that Mrs. Rand is, for all intents and purposes, like the voice of the gods on this island, Mrs. Rand suddenly takes on this bearing as if, like, yeah, I'm the one in charge here. Like, not Paul. I'm the one really pulling the strings here. And it gives a very interesting and well-rounded character.
Especially when you consider that during her confession, she says that she became possessed.
Yeah, she tries to, like, shirk off some of the responsibility for what she did.
Yeah, and I just see that as, like, I don't know, reprehensible a bit.
Well, and also the question is, like, do you buy that? Mm-hmm. Right?
I think the plot says that she's the villain. She's the one who turned Jessica into this way. Sure, Jessica was going to break up the family, but Mrs. Rand is who put us into this particular situation. But what's strange is that, like, the plot says it, but the film as structured doesn't quite say it, because we don't see Mrs. Rand being pulled off to go to jail after or something. She's allowed the same amount of grief as Paul and Betsy at the end. The only way that, like, you can put blame and guilt on Mrs. Rand is if you believe that the supernatural voodoo is real. But the film itself is saying, hey, is this real? I think it is, and doing that implication, but then doesn't hold Mrs. Rand accountable.
I don't know, like, this movie has a lot going on.
Definitely.
It's certainly more ambiguous than Cat People was in regards to, is there something supernatural going on here? Because Cat People eventually, almost you feel like to its chagrin, finally, like, says, yes, there's supernatural stuff happening here. She turns into a cat. But, like, I Walked with a Zombie really refuses to say anything of one way or the other right up until the end, or past the end. It just doesn't. It's ambiguous. I mean, Carafor's a zombie, but, you know, we've established very well now that you can make a zombie with drugs. It's not necessarily a supernatural thing. With Mrs. Rand, I don't know as it really matters if the supernatural is real or not. With Jessica's condition, the doctors are saying, you know, as Sarah mentioned, it was a fever, it burned out her spinal column, and now she's in this zombie-like state. And then Mrs. Rand gives her explanation of what happened, which is, you know, as Sarah said, she asked for the Hungan to turn her into a zombie. Therefore, she believes she's responsible. And it is complex in her scene where she confesses, because she's saying, it's my fault, I was responsible, you know, and has this remorse and guilt, but in the same breath is saying that she was possessed when she made this request. So it's like, how much responsibility are you really taking? But then the response from the doctors are like, right, but whether a zombie's being made supernaturally or with drugs or whatever, the process is the same. You kill the person or bring them to some state that resembles death, a coma or something, and then you bring them out. And that never happened to Jessica, so, you know, you're probably full of shit. You know, nothing really happened. You might have made this request to the Hungan, but it's not your fault because clearly no zombie stuff happened. But then, later, we learn that Paul and Wesley know, but Mrs. Rand doesn't know.
And the doctor.
And the doctor doesn't know that Jessica did go into a coma at one point. So you're just, as an audience member, left with, like, what really happened, and what you choose to believe really happened depends on a lot of unreliable narrators. Because the thing that's really different about this movie is that the full history of what happened at Fort Holland before Betsy's arrival never gets sat down and explained in some sort of, like, objective flashback where we sit down and it's like, here's the real story. Instead, like, you have to put it together and interpret it. And everyone who is giving pieces of the puzzle, they're slightly contradictory. You know, at times, is it Paul's fault that Jessica went mad? Is it Mrs. Rand's? Was it just a fever? And you have to kind of decide, like, okay, do I think this was supernatural or not? That's kind of the first thing as an audience member you have to decide. And then that forks out into, you know, who was responsible for Jessica and so on. But for Mrs. Rand's character, you know, you talk about holding her accountable. And I agree with you, by the way, that she's the villain of the piece, or she's one of the two villains of the piece. But I also think that I Walked with a Zombie is a movie that's not really interested in traditional black and white hero-villain dichotomies. It's telling a story about a bunch of people. Mm-hmm. And these are these people, and this is what's happened to these people, and it's the situation they're in. So it's not really interesting. You know, that's why Mrs. Rand doesn't have a scene where she goes like, the zombies under my control.
Definitely, right? Yeah.
And the thing about Mrs. Rand being accountable, whether something supernatural happened or not, she believes something supernatural has happened. So, yes, she's not really hauled off to jail because ultimately there's nothing really to haul her off to jail for, but she clearly feels the guilt and remorse of what's happened to Jessica because even though she's doing a bunch of morally reprehensible things, she clearly has like a well-meaning heart. She wants, you know, she has a morality. That's why she started doing these things on the island, you know, as you've said, with the best intentions. So she feels bad about what's happened to Jessica, and she feels it's been her fault, and she's been holding this secret of her fault. So the way the movie's holding her accountable is by racking her with that guilt, and that when she finally, you know, confesses all this stuff, now it's out in the open. So the people who do believe it, you know, whether it's Paul or Wesley or whatever, will hold her accountable now, right? Like, in the sense of just blaming her for it. It's not about... I think it's less about other people holding her accountable in an external sense, and more about the fact that internally she feels that guilt, and that's what's holding her accountable. She is miserable, basically, and that that's her comeuppance, is the fact that she lives in tragedy and grief and misery on this shitty island where nothing good ever happens. I think that's would be how I think the movie holds her accountable, as it were.
In that case, I want to bring up Paul.
Yes.
So Paul has a very kind of like, I don't want to say Eeyore type of thing of like, oh, it's gonna rain. But his first lines are to Betsy, and she's like, wow, it's so beautiful. And he's like, is it? Everything here dies.
Yeah, he's definitely got a sort of a nihilistic streak to him.
That's the word, nihilistic. Mm-hmm. And his kind of depressive or kind of cursed attitude or atmosphere also kind of gives weight and form to the colonial history that is in the film for this island. Mm-hmm. And this colonial history and the history of the slave trade is like directly invoked with the figurehead from the slave ship being in the courtyard. The man who drives Betsy up to the manor in the first place is kind of giving her, you know, the lay of the land, and he says exactly this, and that all of the villagers are descended from these slaves who were brought here chained to the bottom of the ship. And her response is something along the lines of like, well, they did bring you to a beautiful place. And he's like, sure.
Yeah, if you say so. Which, like, you could read a couple different ways. One is that, like, yeah, white lady, like, you don't know how shitty this place is. Or you could also read it as, like, yeah, he's never been anywhere else, so, like, is this place beautiful? It's just the only place. Whereas, like, of course, to Betsy it's beautiful. She's from Ontario.
I do love that. She's Canadian. Like, we're always on that.
Canada is, like, I feel like it's a central part of Canadian identity to, like, flip out whenever there's a Canadian in a pop culture thing.
Yeah. And I guess what I appreciate with, like, this invoking of colonialism is it's both love and hate it. Because, like, it's invoked, so it's said, but then it's not explicitly, like, brought up or dealt with. But if you read between the lines of what you were kind of saying before with the Saber Man kind of bringing the practice back away from this white lady, basically. I don't know, there's kind of like, there's a lot of layers going here, and it's very surprising for a film from 1943, made by white guys.
Yeah, in the Hollywood studio system.
Yeah, to have a film that's talking about colonialism, even in it, like, as, I mean, I guess it's fairly explicit for the time, but, like, even in just this manner. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the thing about this movie is there's so much going on here, and the script is so intelligent, which is like another Val Lewton trademark, that feeling that the movie isn't talking down to the audience, that it wants the viewer to think about things, whereas so many other horror movies we watch clearly don't want you to think, because if you start thinking, you'll be like, wait, this doesn't make any fucking sense.
Yeah.
The film is filled with references to classical art, for example, and the treatment of voodoo here feels immensely authentic. It kind of blows the Halpern Brothers and Black Moon and all those other movies like clear out of the water. The movie does portray voodoo in a spooky kind of way that makes you kind of afraid of it because it's part of the unknown, but it also feels like
a documentary.
Right, or that at least the movie is treating voodoo on its own terms, or allowing it to exist as like an equal thing. It doesn't feel like it's being turned into like, I don't know, some kind of like, ooh, Halloween costume thing. The film deals with issues and problems that are much more adult than the typical B horror movie. Just like Cat People did, it's a movie that's about madness, but it's also a movie that's about adultery. And it's also a movie about a desire for death. And that's okay in this movie. The film has the dialogueless climax that we've described a few times here now, and that could be read a few different ways, coming back to the ambiguous nature of the movie. You could read it as Wesley and Jessica being under voodoo control. The exact sequence of events. Jessica goes to the gate, and she can't get out because the gate's closed, and she's just a zombie. But then Wesley comes over and opens it for her and lets her out. And the thing about it is, we've already established that Wesley thinks she should die, that that's a better ending for her than staying alive under her condition. He goes to Betsy and asks if Betsy could basically perform euthanasia, and Betsy says no. So then we see Wesley walk over to the figurehead of Saint Sebastian that Sarah's described. And I don't know, I'm going to have to look up Saint Sebastian because he's got all these arrows in him, and that's a Saint Stephen thing, so I'm not sure. But Wesley pulls out an arrow, and that's ultimately what he uses to stab and kill Jessica, the same time the voodoo doll's getting pinned. So you could read this as they're under voodoo control, or you could read this as completely voluntary, given that they're both doing what they wanted to do anyways, which is Jessica wants to leave, and Wesley thinks she needs to be killed. So, what's really going on? And the other thing that you need to decide how you're going to interpret is that a happy ending? Right? That's the thing that's really wild here for me, looking at this as a Golden Age Hollywood movie, is if you really pay attention to what the movie's telling you, this is kind of the best ending for any of these people, and ultimately the scary voodoo priests are the ones in the right, and they're the ones facilitating this, happiest ending possible for these tragically fucked up white people. And if the story has villains, it's not the voodoo priests, it's the British colonial plantation owner and his missionary mother. Like, Paul's the other villain in this movie. At least depending on how you want to interpret Paul. Because once you've made your choice about is supernatural real or not in this movie, you have to decide, is Paul a good guy or not? Because boy, is he could be anything depending on his, what you want to believe. Because his scenes and his dialogue are so ambiguous and vague. Sometimes it feels like he wants Betsy to fall in love with him and he's flirting and courting her. Other times he's trying to, throw her away and warn her not to, get involved with him or be with him.
Classic Byronic Gothic tropes.
Right. And then it's like, hey, what really happened between Paul and Wesley and Jessica and Mrs. Rand, but really the three of them, because, yeah, I get it that, she wanted to leave Paul for Wesley and they wanted to get off the island. Paul says, he stopped Jessica from leaving the island by force. And he thinks he's responsible for her condition, which is but didn't the doctor say she had a fever? So what happened to her that makes you think you were responsible? And what put her into that coma? And what really happened? And we don't know. And the other thing is, when Paul's having dialogue with Betsy about, you've shown me what love can truly mean, and I'm really in love with you, and isn't this sweet and romantic? The way that he explains that Betsy has really, made him into this better person who understands the value of love is by contrasting it with how he felt around Jessica, which, if you want to interpret this way, he basically says, I was an abusive husband. He doesn't say it that way, but he just sort of says, oh yeah, everything she said or did made me pissed off constantly. So is Paul a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Is Betsy ending up with Paul at the end a good thing? Mm-hmm. Is she going to make him into a better person because of the true meaning of love or whatever? Or is this, tragic for her that she's stuck on this island with, crazy Mrs. Rand and, horrifically depressed Paul? Is this movie ending on a good note? Where, the young lovers are together, which is your standard Hollywood note? Or is that actually a worse ending, for these characters than where they were when they started?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of ways to read this.
And the movie lets you read it how you want to read it. It's up to you. There's a lot of questions left unanswered, and that's for the better, because uncertainty and unknown is what makes for fear and horror, right? We've had that conversation in movies past. One of the really remarkable things that struck me while we were watching this, and it's kind of a trend throughout the Lewton horror movies, certainly the two that we've seen so far, is compared to their contemporaries, these movies frontline women and women's point of view and women's experiences.
Mm-hmm. I remember thinking as we were watching this movie that I couldn't imagine this story being told from just solely a guy. I don't know, I felt I could feel Adele's point of view coming in.
Mm-hmm. This ultimately, if you want to look at the structure of it, is the story of a nurse who comes to help this damaged woman and the woman who caused that condition. That's the main characters. The story hinges on Betsy, Jessica, and Mrs. Rand. Paul and Wesley are important, of course, but they never feel like they're the protagonists. They don't have that feel of this is the ersatz male lead that we sometimes get with these movies. They're supporting characters, the same way that usually women are supporting characters. Mm-hmm. They aren't driving the story. Paul doesn't do anything in this movie. He sits around at his house and gives vague statements about maybe he's good and maybe he's bad.
He plays the piano.
He plays the piano and talks about how everything is death. And Wesley just drinks a lot and bitches at Paul and calls him out on his bullshit with a bitter tone in his voice until it's time for him to get voodoo controlled to go kill Jessica. That's it for those guys. The movie's about three women. One question... So we've talked about, how you can interpret this a bunch of different ways. I guess what I want to ask you now is I'm really curious to know, personally, what do you think's going on in this movie? What's your interpretation? Acknowledging that the movie leaves it ambiguous and there is no right answer, what does Sarah think is happening?
I take the movie at its own terms, and because it's drawing such a strong line between Jessica's movements mm-hmm. And the voodoo and the rituals, I think Jessica is a zombie. I think Mrs. Rand, whether it was a moment of, I don't believe she was possessed, but she was obviously very furious at Jessica, so I think she is directly implicated in Jessica's condition. Now, as far as Wesley killing Jessica, I don't know how voodoo works, but I know how people like to describe miracles or fate or, it just so happened that you were passing by right when you needed to.
Sure.
So Wesley wanting to free Jessica from this state, I think, is his own point of view. That's his agency there. As far as when he decides to take the arrow and kill her, I think it's voodoo kind of persuading these lines to come together.
I'm sort of in a similar boat with you. I think I view the movie's use of voodoo as saying that voodoo influences events that were happening anyways.
Yeah.
Like with Wesley at the end of the movie, what's interesting is we don't see him with a doll, right? We don't see them with a little Wesley doll walking it around. So you don't have that same visual connection between his movements and the voodoo that you do with Jessica, which helps to very much more strongly imply that the voodoo is real.
Very much more strongly.
Yes. But Paul is just kind of sitting on the veranda when Jessica comes walking towards the gate and she can't get outside. And the way that Paul moves when he gets up, lets her out, gets the arrow, follows her, stabs her, is in this kind of, trance-looking set of movements. It doesn't look like...
It feels very deliberate.
Yes, in that kind of zombie style that has kind of become the parlance for this style of acting in horror movies, right? Now, how do you connect that? Well, obviously we see him pin the doll when he stabs Jessica with the arrow. But the other really subtle thing is they're sort of pulling on this Jessica doll with like a string to make it move forward, and then we see Jessica walking, and when she gets to the gate, the doll stops and he can't pull it anymore, and then we see the Saberman go over to the Hungan and whisper in the Hungan's ear, and then the next shot is Paul getting up and letting her out, which to me really strongly implied, he's under their control. Mm-hmm. With the question of is Jessica a zombie, I don't know if... The trick is the movie doesn't quite tell us whatever happened on that night with Paul and Wesley. I get the sense that Paul... The only way Paul believes he's responsible for Jessica's condition is he must have put her in a coma. He must have done something to her. That the fever that she had is a cover for an assault. A lot of the clues for the movie's backstory come in the Calypso song.
Yeah.
Shame and Scandal by Sir Lancelot, whose lyrics are just the story of the movie being told to you. And they talk...
I think we get that in the first 20 minutes or so of the movie.
Yeah. And it's in sort of an interesting set of scenes where Wesley takes Betsy, sort of touring the town. They stop at a little cafe. He gets way too drunk. And this singer, kind of street musician, starts playing this song that clearly everyone on the island knows, and Wesley doesn't really care for it, so he stops singing the song, he apologizes, and then we kind of cut to later that evening, and Wesley has passed out drunk, and the singer starts singing it again. And what's really interesting here is when the singer apologized about it, he said, I would have never started singing this if I had known you were here, and especially here with a lady, I don't mean to embarrass you in front of this woman. And then he makes the explicit choice to sing it to Betsy.
Later. A warning.
Yeah, exactly. The tone is like a warning, because it's night, no one else is there, and he's just walking towards her slowly, singing this song.
The wife and the brother, they want to go, but the Holland man, he tell them no. The wife fall down and the evil came, and it burned her mind in the fever flame.
Wes, we must get back to Fort Holland.
Shame and sorrow for the family. Her eyes are empty and she cannot talk, and the nurse has come to make her walk. The brothers are lonely and the nurse is young, and now you must see that my song is sung. Woe a me, shame and sorrow for the family. Woe a me, shame and sorrow for the family.
And in the song, it describes that the bad woman fell down.
Yeah.
And then that's when the trouble started. So what I think about Jessica being a zombie is that maybe Mrs. Rand went to the Hungan and asked for Jessica to be made a zombie. And maybe that ritual was done at a time that coincided with Jessica being in a coma due to an assault from Paul. And now she never got better from her coma, or she exists post-coma in this state because that ritual was done. So Mrs. Rand didn't really put her into this condition. Paul did, but Mrs. Rand is responsible in a roundabout way for the condition she has sort of now, right? If that makes sense?
Yeah.
And yeah, I just sort of read, I don't really know how to get a handle on Paul, but I don't think he's a good person.
No.
And I'm not sure if Betsy ending up with him is a good ending. I think the implication maybe is that she's making him a good person by showing him, like, love for the first time in his life or whatever, but I don't really like that.
The trope in all of these Gothic novels and everything like that is that the good woman can heal the troubled man.
Right.
So that's a fraught thing in and of itself. You know? So I think that's what you're picking up on.
Yes, and I don't know if I like that trope or agree with that trope, because I think if you start to apply that trope to real life, you end up in a lot of problems.
Yeah.
But on the basis of saying that's the way these kind of stories end, that's the way these stories work, that's what this genre is, we can read it as the movie at least wants us to take it at its word that he will be better with her.
Yeah.
That the movie at least means for this to be a happy ending. Another question that I would like to get to the heart of, and I'm not sure if we can, is, so I think this movie's undeniably chilling, but what are we afraid of here? What's the fear? What's the horror? I think it would be a misreading to characterize this film like Black Moon, where we're just afraid of the natives and the voodoo. But, like, are we afraid of the zombies? Sometimes. There's a lot of varied things that provide the scares in this movie. Jessica's scary at times. Carafor's scary at times. The Saberman is scary at times. The Calypso singer is scary at times. No one's really scary all the time. No one's the monster. Even just, like, one thing that came to me watching the movie is the dark is scary in this movie. And that's something that gets explicitly called out in dialogue, where Paul makes fun of Betsy by saying, like, oh, are you afraid of the dark?
And he lights a match right there without
the Midnight Society. Are we afraid of madness in this movie? Are we afraid of death? Do we welcome death? Are we afraid of a life that's not within our own control? What are we getting at the heart of this movie?
I think you already said it. Fear of the unknown. When Carafor is coming, when he's, like, snooping around the mansion, and then he's coming towards Paul, and he has his arms outstretched as if he's about to give, like, a big bear hug. But it's a very threatening kind of approach, and it's a fear of, like, what is he going to do? Mm-hmm. That's the same fear when Betsy first meets Jessica, like, who is this? What is she going to do? Mm-hmm. And fear of the dark is what's in the dark. Mm-hmm. So I think you're totally on there with talking about how the fears of the unknown, especially of, like, what have I gotten myself into? What is the background of these people?
What is going to happen to me?
Yeah, I'm stuck on this island. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that's what we're supposed to be afraid of, and I think that's why most of the horror in this film comes from the atmosphere.
Yes.
Because it's where you are, Mm-hmm. I think that's probably also why I find the silence so scary in the film, because suddenly, you're getting all this oral information about your surroundings, of, like, where the pond is, where the owl is, everything like that. And then when that's gone, you have no way to orient yourself. What do you think?
Yeah, you're probably right. I think that's
yeah.
It feels so strange to boil down, like, this really complicated movie that has a lot going on and a screenplay that refuses to give you any answers, and then say, well, what's it about? Fear of the unknown. Just because fear of the unknown is the most basic fear that people have. It's the first fear that you have. But I guess that means it's also the most effective one, right?
Yeah. Well, I have a question for you, Ben. Mm-hmm. Where would you rank this?
So, before we get into ranking, which either is going to go very well or very contestedly, I'm not sure, I would like to note that this is our 100th film that we are ranking on the list.
Oh, shit. I had no idea.
Mm-hmm.
We should have, announced that at the beginning.
Now it's a surprise ending. So, for my range for this movie, Sarah, I am pretty certain that this movie is better than the 1934 Black Cat, which is currently sitting at number 6 on the list. And the reason why I think it's better than the Black Cat is that both of these movies have some holes in their story where you're not quite sure what the backstory is and you're not quite sure what's going on, but this movie's doing it on purpose, and the Black Cat has that because a bunch of scenes were cut out and fucked around with in the censoring of the movie.
I also was gravitating towards the Black Cat because I Walked with a Zombie has a very strong sense of place and horror coming from that, and the Black Cat has that as well.
Yeah, for sure. So, that's my floor, is above the Black Cat.
Okay.
And then, above there we've got Island of Lost Souls. And I'm not sure if this is better or worse. They both take place on a mysterious island with some,
some lost souls.
And some colonialism and that sort of thing. Above Island of Lost Souls, we have Short Carlin. And I'm not sure if this is better than that. I think there's more menace in I Walked with a Zombie, and it has more of an edge for my money, and I prefer a movie like this that has ambiguities and lets me think about things rather than the Phantom Carriage, which is a sermon.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the Phantom Carriage has some pretty dire shit going on in it that's pretty intense. Above that, we have The Old Dark House, which also has the fucked up family with a mysterious backstory element.
And everyone feels like they have a backstory.
Yes, and it's got that same claustrophobic sense of place. But what this movie doesn't have is comic relief that's trying to cut the tension, the way that The Old Dark House has, some comic relief elements in it. And then we get to the real questions, the real meaty dilemmas of, is I Walked with a Zombie better than Cat People? And, we talked about at the top of the segment here that, you don't think it is. And the last time we watched this, I thought it was. Val Lewton thought it was. And then it's is it better than Jekyll and Hyde, though? My thoughts there are that, Jekyll and Hyde is very intense and has, a lot of really unpleasant stuff in it, and also has a very intelligent script with very well-rounded characters. And it's been at the top of the list for a very long time. I think, personally, I really like what you called the quiet horror in this movie. Maybe that makes sense of why I like Vampire. But there's something about the sort of understated nature of this movie that is, to me, more powerful than Jekyll and Hyde, which is a good movie, but kind of definitely jumps around and is a bit over the top and kind of yells and screams at you. It's very performative.
It's just funny to describe a film as performative.
Right. But yeah, it's a very loud movie. It's not subtle. So that's my range, Sarah. My range is 1 to 5.
Oof.
I can go anywhere in there, but that's my range. I'm not sure about anything other than it's better than the Black Cat from 34. Where are you looking?
So like I mentioned, I also kind of had my eyes towards the Black Cat. And when I was first looking at ranking, I was like, this is pretty comparable. So this is a good place to put a ceiling.
Okay, so you went the other direction from me.
I didn't quite know where to stop. I kind of just ended up stopping at 19, The Walking Dead, because of the way that they control atmosphere. But I just wasn't really sure where to stop. I don't know, what kind of threw a wrench into everything for me was Furman Maria, because of how, oof, that movie was. And that really brought in a sense of place and of terror.
And it also frontlines a female perspective in a way that's rare, but that this movie does.
Yeah. So, let's call my range 6 to 13. Looking above the Black Cat, I definitely see where you're coming from. I don't think I could put I Walked with a Zombie over The Old Dark House. I don't really remember the comedy parts. I just remember that movie feeling so oppressive, and that the weird old lady sister who was like terrorizing the like young beautiful woman like in the mirrors and stuff. Like, I feel like Old Dark House deserves to be above I Walked with a Zombie.
A lot of the comic relief elements are sort of from the various people who keep ending up at the house throughout the night and, like, sitting around the fire and having a bunch of dialogue about, like, oh, what do you do for a living? And here's my opinion on that. The kind of stage play elements of Old Dark House, where it's just a bunch of people standing around talking, as opposed to, like, the visual film elements of that movie, which are more straight horror.
A lot of those dialogue scenes, though, do turn into feelings of darkness, at the very least.
Yeah.
That's why everyone feels like they have lived-in lives,
yes,
as it were. But I see where you're coming from with Island of Lost Souls and Phantom Carriage. I think it's harder to pull off this quiet kind of horror than Phantom Carriage's bash you over the head with the message kind of thing. Not that Short Carlin is not an incredibly well-made film. I'm just, having to rank these, so I'm happy to say things. And Island of Lost Souls definitely has the colonialism elements to it, but I think it's done in a much more, it feels like it's handled with gloves and kind of far away, compared to I Walked with a Zombie, where it feels very steeped into even the themes of the film.
Well, it's because Island of Lost Souls is doing the Star Trek thing. It's handling colonialism through allegory, right? Where it's like, we have a mad scientist and his, village of beast people. We're not directly saying, yeah, here's a sugarcane plantation owner and, like, all of his ex-slaves. Like,
yeah.
It's way more just text, right, in I Walked with a Zombie?
Yeah.
The thing, too, with me and this movie, and it's something that this movie shares with cat people, is the characters in this movie feel like people. Real people. And I get that is kind of what you were saying, too, about Old Dark House. But for my money, like, Lost Souls doesn't have that. Dr. Moreau is a great character, but he is definitely just, like, a villain. And the lead character of that movie, whose name I don't remember, because he's just as nondescript and boring as most horror movie protagonists, he doesn't even really feel like a hero to fight Dr. Moreau. He's just a point of view.
He doesn't even fight Dr. Moreau.
No, he's there so the story has a reason to be told, right? In order to tell the story of Dr. Moreau's Island, we need someone who goes there and leaves there. So that's what he is. There's nothing else to his character. And Phantom Carriage, the characters are well drawn out in the sense that, like, the movie's going to tell you everything about them. But they are definitely archetypes in a morality play. It's the well-meaning nun and the, lousy drunk and, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I don't know. I'm willing to say that this goes below Old Dark House because of the intensity of that movie. It's certainly more intense than I Walked with a Zombie, which is a bit more of a, as we keep saying, a quieter movie, sort of a sleeper movie,
Almost like you become the zombie.
That's sort of mean. I think I Walked with a Zombie is a movie that sticks with you after it's done and you turn the lights out and you have to, like, make your way back to your bedroom in the dark or whatever. Whereas Old Dark House is going to get you, like, while you're watching the movie. So I'm kind of willing to put it here, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, so entering the list under the Old Dark House, above Short Carlin, so at number 4 on the list, is I Walked with a Zombie from 1943, directed by Jacques Tourneur.
If you would like to see this list, you can go to our website, screamscenepodcast.tumblr.com. There you can find links to the other episodes that we've mentioned. Again, if you want to hear more about the history of Haiti and how voodoo relates to it, you can listen to episode 32 on the film White Zombie. On our website, you can also find an appeals box if you would like to submit an appeal about this or any other ranking, any kind of concerns, questions. Hey, you missed this movie? You can submit it through our website or email us directly at screamscenepodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter @_screamscene.
Scream Scene updates every Wednesday on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Google Play. You can help the show out by leaving a rating or a review on the service that you listen to the show on, if it allows it. Another way you can help out the show is just by sharing us with a friend, whether that's on social media or in the real world. A direct financial way you can help out the show is by heading to patreon.com/screamscenepodcast, where you can become a patron of the night for as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels, such as $5 and $10, there are regular rewards for patrons. If we hit our first Patreon goal of $150 a month, we'll start doing a horror-adjacent movie episode once a month, where we might cover films like King of the Zombies or Zombies on Broadway.
I just imagine, like, zombies with, like, top hats and canes doing that frog song.
Yeah, or like...
Hello, my baby. Hello, my darling.
Or like the thing from that one Bugs Bunny cartoon of like, oh, we're the boys of the chorus. We hope you like our show. Yeah, absolutely. So if you would like to see those zombies in a kick line, you'll need to head over to patreon.com/screamscenepodcast.
What are we watching next week, Ben?
Well, Sarah, we are just trucking along. We are headed right into The Leopard Man,
Ooh.
the next RKO movie from Val Lewton and Jacques Tourneur.
We're just pumping these babies out.
Yep.
Well, we will see you next week, creatures of the night.
Bye.
Bye.